Everyone, here we are at our first lecture on becoming human. In looking at this history of the early people, how was it that they were able to become one of the most successful species on Earth? Part of it was due to environmental changes. There was an ice age in Africa that brought forth new vegetation, new plants once that ice age had ended. So people had much more food available to them. They could live off of foraging off of these bushes, and there was enough plants, there was enough food for them to start to thrive and succeed in small bands. The early people were also the most adaptable species. In thinking about this Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest, what does the fittest actually mean? Does it actually mean that they are the strongest people? Well, we know that the early people were not the strongest animals. They weren't the strongest species. You look at lions, bears, these species are stronger, but they weren't able to thrive in the same way that people did. So how was it that people were so successful, even compared to other groups that were evolving in that time? Humans were able to adapt. So it was that ability to adapt that enabled them to succeed in ways that other species weren't. So they don't have to be the strongest, they don't have to have the sharpest teeth, they just had to adapt to new environments, new situations in ways that the dinosaurs weren't able to do. The environmental changes brought about their demise, but humans were able to adapt with those environmental changes. So if it's too cold, put on extra clothes. If it's too hot, take off extra layers of clothes, jump in a lake. And there was different ways that they were able to adapt. Most historians and scientists have traced the origins of the early humans to Africa, and it was out of Africa that these early people started to migrate to Asia, Europe, and to North America a bit later on across a land bridge that is no longer there. So what makes Homo sapiens, what makes these early people different from other species? Bipedalism. Most species walked on all fours, so that meant that their hands as well as their feet were being used in this process of moving, whereas humans now can walk on 2 feet, freeing up their hands to make tools, to defend themselves with weapons, to carry their children. So now when you're migrating to new, more hospitable areas, and you're moving as a group, you're just using your feet, and your hands are able to carry children, carry supplies, fight off dangers, fight off predators or enemies, whatever it might be. This was a pretty large advantage for early humans. Using tools was also advantageous to early people. Again, for hunting, for protecting, they were able to, they didn't have these teeth of a predator, right? They didn't have teeth like lions or wolves, but they were able to create tools that pretty much mimicked those teeth, so that they could kill these animals, cut them up, and consume them just as if they were a lion or a wolf, but using tools instead of their own teeth. Controlling and making fire was also something unique to those early people, and controlling and making fire provides a lot of different things. It provides heat, it provides that safety from the cold, it provides a meeting place for people. It symbolizes that these early people were controlling their environment, that they are controlling nature, that they are not looking at it as something outside of their control, but they are realizing that they can be a force that controls nature. It was also a social thing. It was a gathering place, so that people would come around the fire. It became central to their social life, especially at nighttime. It's a source of light, it's a source of energy, and it's a real focal point for their community. So this is an advantage of early people as well. Developing cognitive skills, so the ability to speak, but not just communicate with grunts and noises as other animals are able to do, but to be able to make these noises fit together in certain ways to form words, and then to form more complex ideas with those words. And this is important in passing down knowledge to future generations. And this goes back to that first introduction when I talked about the fact that we are inheritors of thousands of years of human history and knowledge, that all of these things have to be thought up and conceived of and passed down, and we benefit from all that knowledge. So it's easy for us to look back and judge early people and say, "Wow, they weren't very bright. What were they thinking? Why did they do things this way?" But we are just benefiting from the knowledge that they have put together, that they have passed down to us, and it's through this developing cognitive skills that they were able to put ideas and knowledge into words and pass them down, and eventually write it down and pass it down. And that's something that wasn't done before. So if a person was able to adapt and excel and learn new traits, that knowledge died with them, oftentimes with early people who couldn't communicate that knowledge onto others. That knowledge would just die when they died. But now you're able to take that life's experience and that life's knowledge, that trial and error, and pass it down to your kids so that they start off a little bit further than you. So it was their brains were getting larger, they were getting smarter, and that they were able to pass that information on to future generations. Now we're going to look at two different periods today in the Stone Age: the Paleolithic Era, which is defined by mostly small bands of people hunting and gathering, foraging, living in small caves, groups of about 20 people, to the Neolithic Era after the Agrarian Revolution. Both of these are under the Stone Age, so stone is the primary tool that these early people are using. So first we're going to look at the Paleolithic Era, which is defined by small groups of people hunting and gathering. So they would have been foraging for edible plants. The women typically were the ones who would forage for the edible plants, while men would go and hunt game and bring back meat. Most of their diet, though, was focused on the plants that were edible. So women had a larger role in society than they later would have, because they contributed equal or more than men did to these societies' diets. They would also rely on fishing. These small groups of 20 to 30 people, most of them related to each other, would move around looking for different vegetation to live off of, and also chasing the animals that they were hunting. But they didn't stay in place for very long. These were not settled communities. These were nomadic communities that were going where the food was, but also running away from whatever dangers there was, or environmental changes. So they were always on the move. They were quite mobile, which meant they didn't really accumulate a lot of property or a lot of goods. They didn't have a lot of personal belongings that they would need to carry with them everywhere. In hunting these animals, they would use up pretty much every part of those animals. Everything was useful in one way or another. This is an example of an early human dwelling in Ukraine. As you could tell, they used every bit of the animals to make their shelter and lodging. And you could tell they also did not make permanent homes. That this was not a stone building that is meant to last generations. This is a temporary dwelling place. These bands of people would intentionally remain small, because the larger they got, the harder it would be to feed them, to take care of everybody, to defend themselves, and also to move away from danger and to keep everybody safe and together. So the smaller numbers, the safer they were, especially from outside dangers. People in this era would make tools out of stone, wood, or bones to dig, to hunt. Many of them would make tools that resembled the teeth of predators, so that they were able to hunt and cut up their meat. They were able to ground up foods that would otherwise be inedible, smash up foods. They were able to cook foods with fire that, again, otherwise would have been inedible. They also got nutritional value from cooking these foods, and their diet was able to expand with the use of these tools and with the use of fire to cook their food. How do historians know how these early people used tools, or what these tools were used for? Well, they found a lot of these in archaeological sites, but also they're able to look at hunting and gathering communities in the present day in isolated regions who also use the same types of tools as those early humans did. And they're able to look at these societies and see and understand how early humans lived. So as these early humans' brains grew bigger, their diets expanded, and they were able to eat more things. And again, their bodies were getting stronger, their brains were getting larger, they were able to develop more cognitive skills, and as we talked about, pass on information to the youngest generations. They were able to adapt faster, and larger communities were able to start forming where they can have a written code, a written knowledge to pass down to generations, but also start writing rules down about how society was to be regulated, so that these communities became more adaptable, more longer lasting, and more structured. They were able to start creating their own cultures. So in these foraging communities that would develop in the Paleolithic era, a couple things that I want to focus on. The division of labor, we previously mentioned that the women would be responsible for the foraging, for finding food out of the nearby plants that were edible, and they were primarily the foragers because of the fact that they had to stay closer to home. The men were the hunters because they were not as attached to child rearing, to raising children, as the women were biologically, so they would just leave their communities for several days and go hunting and bring back food for their families, whereas the women would stay closer to home, forage for edible foods, and take care of the children. However, women were providing equal to or more of the food for their communities to live off of, and their status in society was more equal to men's than we are used to in modern history. So in modern history, the man is considered the breadwinner, but also the political head of his family. He was the one who can go out into public life and have occupations, to be involved in public life, whereas the woman is supposed to stay home, not have political rights, not have let's say religious rights as leaders in their religious circles, etc. Whereas back then, women and men had a more equal standing because of the fact that they were considered partners in providing for their communities. The women provided a lot of food for their families, the man did as well. So they were considered more equal partners in that survival, but women had to stay closer to home because of the child rearing. This was also true in Native American societies up until European encounter with the Native Americans. When Europeans would arrive in the Americas, they looked at Native Americans who had a more equal division of labor and equal gender relations between men and women, and Europeans criticized Native Americans for this and said that the men were emasculated, that they were not being kings over their families. Women would have religious power, women would go out and farm, all of these things, and Europeans looked at that and said, this is a out of whack society that we need to change, and that was a very common argument for colonizing Native American societies. The Europeans looked at the Native Americans and said they don't have these stark gender roles, this dark division of gender roles, and they used that as a criticism but also a justification for the need to change that society. These small bands of 20 to 30 people were mostly, again, related to each other in certain ways, so their relationships with one another were more personal rather than hierarchical, so they wouldn't have these hierarchies. They wouldn't have a king over their area whose son would become a king, whose son would become a king of their community. They didn't have those type of hierarchies. They related to each other as an extended family, and when there were different social distinctions, but these were not based on wealth like they might be today, that the people with the most money are highest in our hierarchy, or with the most goods. That wouldn't be relevant to these early people because accumulating a lot of stuff was not very good or practical, considering that they were nomadic and had to keep moving. So they valued things like age, wisdom, experience, and those were the people who were given respect and seen as the leaders of these societies. So these societies were families. Everybody knew each other. They were organized based on these familial relationships. Though they would make contact with other groups, they would talk to each other, celebrate. This was also an important way to find different partners, because obviously we're not getting married with family. It was important to find other people, other partners, other groups to expand the gene pool. You don't want to be doing that stuff with your family. So trade was a good way for people to start meeting new people, interacting with other groups. They could trade tools, food, goods, jewelry, and ideas, learn from one another, but also, again, people. So that once these societies would have contact and start trading with one another, different relationships were formed. And once two people would make these partnerships, once they would quote-unquote get married, you would leave your group and follow with your partner's group and join their clan. And that way you have blood being introduced to these clans. And again, as these societies are developing, as they're growing larger, as they are growing cognitively, they're able to start creating their own cultures. They start creating their own creation myths, how they believe that the earth was formed and how they came into the earth, what their place in the earth is. You see this type of spirituality, this complex thinking, that they're starting to think about their place in the world now. They're not just animals fighting for survival, thinking about their next meal, but they're starting to think more abstractly about God and gods, how the world came to be, how they came to be in it. And they started to create art, and we have these artifacts. This one in particular is called Venus, from present-day Austria, about 25,000 years ago. Notice her headdress. Her hands are resting on her breasts. And most archaeologists and historians would say that this represents beauty standards of the day. But my question to you guys is, what could this also represent? Because there really is no way for us to know. But how would you explain this figurine? Is it a woman who holds authority, a powerful female deity, something about fertility, or is it a sexualized image? We don't really know what the purpose of this art is, but as historians, we're left asking questions and trying to piece together these stories. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do with cave paintings that I'm assigning for this week's discussions. These cave paintings, most of them are found in different places of the world, in caves that nobody lived in, that no natural light touched. So they weren't necessarily as decorations, because again, nobody would be living there looking at it. So what is the purpose of creating these objects? Many of them are of animals, could represent a form of animism, which is this religious belief that there are spirits living in everything, every physical object, whether it's a stone, a river, or the animals, and it might be representing what's important to these people. And then we have images of handprints on walls. I'm going to be having you look at this. These were found in different areas. The first one you're going to be looking at in your discussion is from Australia, about 15,000 to 10,000 years before the Common Era. One is found in Australia. One is more recent, 8,000 BC, from Argentina. So these are found in different areas, several thousand years apart. And in your discussion, I want you to tell me what these images tell you as a historian. What can you infer from these images?